she whispered, and the words were swallowed by the sound of rain sluicing down the slick asphalt. Her voice, the only music he had ever truly heard, was breaking. I can't be this person, Julian, the one who looks away. He stood before her, stripped of all his power, all his control. The city's indifferent lights blurred behind her, turning her into a silhouette of heartbreak. His bespoke suit, tailored to withstand anything, was soaked through, clinging to him like a second, colder skin. It offered no defense against this. Nothing did. Don't, he managed to say, the single word a raw tear in the fabric of the night. It was a command, a plea, a prayer. He was a man who commanded legions, who could make fortunes shift with a single phone call. But he could not command this. He could not make her stay. I love you, she said, and it was a confession that felt like a condemnation. A tear spilled over, tracing a path through the grime and exhaustion on her cheek. But I can't live in your world. I can't build my happiness on the pain of others. She took a step back, then another. Each movement was a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs. He wanted to reach for her, to chain her to him if he had to, but her resolve was a wall of glass between them, impassable, and one wrong move would shatter everything. He was already shattered. He watched her turn and walk away, melting into the city that had always been his dominion, but now felt like a foreign, hostile land. The rain fell harder, a merciless torrent, as if the sky itself were trying to wash away the scent of her, the memory of her warmth. But it couldn't. Nothing ever could. He was left alone in the dark, with nothing but the echoing sound of her goodbye. A king on a throne of shadows, utterly and completely dethroned. It had all started in a place just like this one, an alley, grimy, smelling of refuse and damp concrete. A place where endings were common, but for him, it had been a beginning. 3 months earlier, the air in the alley had been thick with humidity and the low thrum of a city that never slept. Julian Kang leaned against the cold brick, a ghost in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. The darkness was his natural habitat, a comfortable cloak he wore as easily as the expensive fabric. His face, a study in sharp angles and severe beauty, was cast in shadow, save for the faint scar that bisected his left eyebrow, a permanent reminder of a lesson learned in blood and betrayal long ago. Before him, 2 men in lesser suits trembled, their fear a palpable scent in the air. The arrangement was clear, Mr. Saito, Julian said, his voice a low, placid rumble that held more menace than any shout. It was the sound of stones grinding together at the bottom of a river. You had a responsibility. You failed to meet it. His second-in-command, Min Jun, stood a few feet away, silent and still as a statue, his presence a promise of violence more potent than any weapon. Julian didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to make threats. His very existence was a threat. He was the head of the Cheongryong Syndicate, a position he had inherited, a crown of thorns he wore with chilling grace. This world of clandestine meetings and veiled intimidation was the only one he knew. It was his birthright and his prison. Suddenly, a loud clang shattered the tense quiet. A metal service door at the end of the alley slammed open, and a woman stumbled out, wrestling with a black trash bag that was nearly as big as she was. Julian's head turned, his focus shifting with the fluid deadliness of a predator. Annoyance flickered in his dark eyes. An interruption, an unknown variable. He hated them. The woman was a chaotic splash of life in his monochrome world. She wore a stained black apron over a simple t-shirt and jeans. Her hair, a cascade of unruly brown waves, was haphazardly tied up, but strands had escaped to frame a face smudged with dirt and something that looked suspiciously like chocolate frosting. She grunted with effort, her entire being focused on the singular, undignified task of hauling garbage to the dumpster. She didn't seem to notice them at first. The 3 men in dark suits radiating enough silent danger to make a normal person freeze. She was in her own world of exhaustion and frustration. Then she looked up, and her gaze collided with his. For Julian Kang, the world stopped. It didn't slow down. It didn't fade. It simply ceased to exist. The alley, the nervous men, the loyal shadow of Minjun, all of it vanished. There was only her. Her eyes, a startling shade of green, were filled with a weariness that he recognized, but hers was different. His was the weariness of the soul. Hers was the honest fatigue of hard labor. There was a smudge of blue paint just below her temple, a tiny, vibrant rebellion against the grime. He saw everything in that one frozen second. Her resilience, her stubborn independence, a flicker of defiance in the set of her jaw. She was not beautiful in the polished, sterile way of the women who moved through his world. She was captivating, real, a firefly in a jar of shadows. Elara Vance felt his stare like a physical touch. Her tired brain, which had been solely focused on the trajectory of the leaking trash bag, suddenly screeched to a halt. The man leaning against the wall was not just a man. He was an event, tall, impossibly handsome in a way that felt dangerous, and dressed in a suit that probably cost more than her car and her student loan debt combined. The intensity of his gaze was a punch to the chest, stealing the air from her lungs. A primal part of her screamed danger, but another, more reckless part was simply stunned. She blinked, breaking the spell. He was in her way. The dumpster was behind him. "Excuse me," she said, her voice rough with fatigue. The men in suits tensed, but the main one, the dangerous one, didn't move. He just watched her, his expression unreadable. She shifted the weight of the bag. "Look, I'd love to stand here and admire the ambiance, but this thing is starting to leak something I'd rather not identify." Nothing. He just kept looking at her. A spark of her usual sarcasm, her primary defense mechanism against the world, flared to life. "Are you planning to move?" she asked, arching an eyebrow. "Or is this the new VIP lounge?" A flicker of something. Surprise? Amusement? Crossed his face. A corner of his perfectly sculpted mouth twitched, the barest hint of a smile. It transformed his severe features into something devastating. He pushed himself off the wall with a languid grace and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He stepped aside, clearing her path. Elara didn't wait for a second invitation. She practically threw the bag into the dumpster, the lid crashing down with a satisfying bang. Wiping her hands on her apron, she turned to leave, deliberately not looking at him again. That one look had been enough. It felt like touching a live wire. She just wanted to get back inside, finish her shift, and fall into her lumpy bed. But she could feel his eyes on her back every step of the way. As the service door clicked shut behind her, Julian remained motionless. The scent of her, something like coffee, cheap soap, and turpentine, lingered in the air, cutting through the alley's stench. "Sir?" Minjun prompted softly, his voice pulling Julian back to the present. The two trembling businessmen were still waiting, their faces pale. Julian had forgotten they were there. He turned his gaze back to them, but the fire was gone, replaced by a cold, dismissive emptiness. "We are finished here," he said, his tone final. "I will expect what is owed. Do not make me ask again." They scrambled away, tripping over themselves in their haste to escape. Julian stared at the closed service door. A feeling he couldn't name, a strange, hollow ache that was also a vibrant thrum of life, settled in his chest. He had lived his life in a fortress of his own making, surrounded by loyalty born of fear and duty. He had never felt anything. Not really. Not like this. This sudden, inexplicable need. "Minjun," he said, his voice quiet. "Sir, find out who she is." Her name was Elara Vance. She was 26 years old. She had a mountain of student debt from an art degree she was barely using. She worked 40 hours a week as a barista at a cafe called The Daily Grind, and another 20 as a part-time art restoration assistant at a small, dusty studio. She lived in a cramped apartment with a roommate and sent half of her meager earnings to her mother in a different state, who was battling a chronic illness. Julian read the report compiled by his people, and the sterile facts painted a picture of a life that was the complete antithesis of his own. Her life was a struggle for survival. His was a struggle for control. Yet, the woman described in these pages felt more alive than anyone he had ever known. The report included a grainy photo of her, laughing with a friend outside the coffee shop. The image was a stab of light in the darkness of his office. He knew it was madness. A man in his position did not get involved with civilians. It was a risk, a liability, a weakness his enemies would not hesitate to exploit. His uncle, Chairman Park, the venomous old guard of the syndicate, would see it as a fatal flaw. Julian didn't care. For the first time, there was something he wanted, not something his family needed or his organization required, something for himself. He went to the coffee shop the next day. Ilara was behind the counter, a smudge of flour on her nose, her movements a whirlwind of efficiency as she frothed milk and took orders. The bell above the door chimed, and she looked up, her practiced customer service smile freezing on her face. It was him, the man from the alley. He was even more intimidating in the light of day. Dressed in another immaculate suit, this one a deep navy, he seemed to suck all the air out of the cozy, coffee-scented space. People instinctively moved out of his way. He walked directly to the counter and stopped in front of her. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice betraying none of the sudden jackhammering in her chest. "A black coffee," he said. His voice was just as she remembered, a low, quiet sound that made the hairs on her arms stand up. His eyes, dark and unblinking, were fixed on her. She nodded, her movements stiff as she turned to prepare his drink. She could feel him watching her, every single motion. It was unnerving, invasive. She slammed the cup down on the counter a little harder than necessary. $2.50. He placed a crisp $100 bill on the counter. She stared at it. "I don't have change for this." It was a lie, but she didn't want his money. It felt tainted. "Keep it," he said, his gaze never wavering. "We have a tip jar for a reason," she retorted, her sarcasm kicking in again. "It's the little glass thing with thank you written on it. You can't miss it." A ghost of that smile returned. "I am not tipping you, Miss Vance. I am buying a moment of your time." The use of her name hit her like a bucket of ice water. Her blood ran cold. "How do you know my name?" "I am a resourceful man." "That's not an answer. That's a threat." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "Who are you? Are you police? FBI? Did my deadbeat dad finally get into some real trouble?" "I am none of those things," he said calmly, picking up his coffee. "My name is Julian Kang, and I would like to take you to dinner." Ilara laughed, a short, sharp, incredulous sound. "You've got to be kidding me. You learn my name through some creepy, probably illegal means, and you think that's a good opening line?" "No, absolutely not. The answer is no." "I see," he said. He didn't look disappointed. He didn't look anything. He simply absorbed her rejection as if it were a piece of data. "Enjoy the coffee," she snapped, turning to the next customer. But when she glanced back a moment later, he was gone. The $100 bill was still on the counter. He didn't come back the next day or the day after. Ilara started to think she had imagined the whole bizarre encounter. Then, a package arrived at her apartment. A large, flat box with no return address. Her roommate, Chloe, eyed it with suspicion. "Could be a bomb," Chloe said, ever the pragmatist. "Or worse, anthrax." "It's probably just my new phone case," Ilara muttered, slicing it open with a kitchen knife. Inside, nestled in black tissue paper, was a set of Kolinsky sable paintbrushes, the kind she had only ever dreamed of holding. Beside them was a collection of professional-grade oil paints in colors so vibrant they seemed to hum with energy. It was a fortune. A small, beautiful fortune she could never, ever afford. There was no note. There didn't need to be one. She knew who it was from. Fury warred with a confusing, treacherous sense of being seen. He knew she was an artist. He knew what these tools meant. It was an intimate gesture from a man who was a complete and terrifying stranger. It felt like a violation. It also felt wonderful, and she hated that. She hated it so much. He found her 2 days later as she was leaving the restoration studio, her hands stained with pigment. He was leaning against a sleek black car that looked like it belonged in a spy movie, Min Jun standing silently by the driver's door. "This has to stop," she said, marching right up to him. She held up the box of supplies. "Take it back." "They are a gift," Julian said, his expression unreadable. "A gift from who? My mysterious stalker?" Her voice was sharp as broken glass. "How did you know about this? How did you find out where I live? This isn't charming, it's creepy. Is it even legal?" For the first time, he looked almost apologetic. "Probably not," he admitted, his honesty disarming her for a second. "But I had to know you." "Why?" The question burst out of her, filled with all her frustration and fear and a sliver of desperate curiosity. "Why me?" "I don't have an answer for that," he said, and she believed him. "When I saw you in that alley, it was like I had been living in a black and white world, and you were the first color I had ever seen." The words were so unexpected, so poetic, that they silenced her. Her anger faltered. He took a step closer, his presence overwhelming. "My world is complicated, Alara. I understand your fear. I understand your hesitation. But I am not a threat to you. I never will be. You had me investigated," she shot back, clinging to her anger. "That feels like a threat." "It was a means to an end," he said. "The only way I knew how to get from that alley to this moment. Give me one chance to prove I am more than my methods. One dinner. If, after that, you tell me to leave you alone, I will disappear from your life. You will never see me again. I give you my word." She looked into his eyes, searching for a lie, for a hint of deception. She found none. She only found a profound, unnerving sincerity and a loneliness so deep it seemed to pull at her own. Against every instinct, against all common sense, she heard herself say the one word that would change everything. Fine. The restaurant wasn't just a restaurant. It was a pocket universe of impossible luxury perched on the top floor of a skyscraper. The entire wall was glass, offering a god's-eye view of the city, glittering like a carpet of scattered diamonds below. The tables were spaced so far apart they might as well have been on different continents. Alara, in the only nice dress she owned, felt like an imposter, a field mouse at a banquet for lions. Julian, however, was perfectly at home. The staff deferred to him with a reverence that bordered on fear. He didn't need a menu. He simply spoke to the waiter in a low voice, and a parade of exquisite dishes began to appear, each one a work of art. He was a perfect gentleman. He pulled out her chair. He listened, truly listened, when she spoke. He asked her about her art, about the techniques of restoration, about the painting she dreamed of creating one day. No one had ever asked her those questions with such genuine, focused interest. Her father had been a ghost, her mother was too consumed by her illness, and her friends, while supportive, didn't understand the passion that drove her. But he did. Or he seemed to. "My mother, she's sick," Ilara found herself saying, the wine and the surreal atmosphere loosening her tongue. "The medical bills are a lot. That's why I work 2 jobs. It's never enough." "What is her condition?" Julian asked, his dark eyes soft with something she couldn't quite decipher. She told him. She told him everything. The failed treatments, the indifferent doctors, the crushing weight of the financial burden. It all came spilling out. He listened without interruption, his gaze never leaving her face. When she finished, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek, he reached across the table and gently brushed it away with his thumb. His touch was electric, a searing jolt that shot straight to her core. "I can help," he said simply. "No," she said immediately, pulling back. "No, I can't accept that. I don't want your money." "It is not about money," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "It is about access. There is a doctor, a specialist in Boston. He is the best. I can make a call. Your mother will have an appointment by the end of the week. This is not for you to accept or refuse. It is something I am doing." It was a command disguised as an offer, an act of immense kindness delivered with the casual authority of a king. She didn't know what to say. The hope it ignited in her was so fierce it was painful. Could she really refuse? Could she let her pride stand in the way of her mother's health? She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw past the power and the wealth. She saw the man he described himself as, one who lived in a complicated world. She saw the loneliness in his eyes, the invisible weight on his shoulders, and she felt a pull, a dangerous, irresistible magnetic force drawing her in. That night, he walked her to the door of her shabby apartment building. Under the flickering fluorescent light of the entryway, the spell of the skyscraper palace was broken. They were back in her world. "Thank you for dinner," she said, her voice small. "The pleasure was mine," he replied. He stood a breath away from her, and the space between them crackled with unspoken tension. "So," she said, trying to sound casual, "do I tell you to disappear now?" He was silent for a long moment. "Do you want me to?" he asked, his voice low and raw. She met his gaze, and in that moment, she knew she was lost. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but beneath it, something else was blooming, a wild, reckless desire. "No," she whispered. His eyes darkened and he leaned in, closing the small distance between them. His kiss was not what she expected. It wasn't rough or demanding. It was tentative at first, a question. Then, as she responded, it deepened, becoming a torrent of pent-up longing, of a hunger that seemed to go soul-deep. It was a kiss that tasted of expensive wine, secrets, and a profound, aching loneliness that she felt she was somehow meant to heal. When he pulled away, they were both breathless. "I will see you tomorrow, Alara," he said. It wasn't a question, it was a promise. And so began their impossible love affair. They lived in two separate worlds that they tried desperately to merge. Some days were spent in his world, charity galas where Alara felt like a dressed-up doll, silent drives in his armored car where the city flashed by like a distant film, quiet evenings in his penthouse, a sterile glass box in the sky that was more a fortress than a home. He would watch her sketch for hours, his focus absolute, as if her creating something beautiful was the only miracle he needed to witness. Other days were spent in hers. They walked through crowded parks, eating hot dogs from a street vendor. He looked absurdly out of place in his perfect suit, but he never complained. He came to her tiny apartment and didn't flinch at the peeling paint or the noisy neighbors, drinking coffee from a chipped mug as he watched her work on a small canvas. In these moments, he wasn't Julian Kang, head of the Cheongryong. He was just Julian, a man who looked at her as if she were the sun. He was true to his word about her mother. A private jet flew her to Boston. The best doctor in the country took her case. For the first time in years, her prognosis was hopeful. Alara's gratitude was a tidal wave, washing away the last of her reservations. How could a man who did this be evil? His world was gray, he had told her. She was determined to paint it in color. She was falling in love with him, deeply, irrevocably. She ignored the red flags, the way he never spoke of his family business in detail, the constant, silent presence of Min Jun, the way he would sometimes go rigid at the sound of a backfiring car. She chose to see only the good, the gentleness he reserved only for her, the fierce protectiveness in his eyes, the way he made her feel cherished and safe. For a girl who had spent her life fighting, safety was the most seductive thing of all. The illusion, however, was a fragile thing, and it was destined to break. They were driving back from a late dinner, the city lights a hypnotic blur outside the tinted windows of the sedan. Alara was leaning her head on his shoulder, humming softly, a feeling of pure contentment warming her. Julian was relaxed, one arm draped around her. his usual tension eased by her presence. It happened in a flash. A black van swerved out of a side street, ramming into their car with a deafening screech of metal on metal. Ilara was thrown forward, saved from injury only by her seatbelt and Julian's arm, which shot out to brace her with lightning speed. Before the sound of the impact had even faded, another car screeched to a halt behind them, boxing them in. Julian was no longer the gentleman she knew. In an instant, he transformed. His body went rigid, his face becoming a mask of cold fury. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice like ice. Min Jun, in the front seat, was already moving, speaking urgently into a hidden microphone on his collar. Men in dark suits poured out of the other vehicles, their intentions unmistakable. Ilara saw the glint of metal, guns. Her blood ran cold. This wasn't a random accident. This was an attack. "Julian, what's happening?" she cried, her voice trembling. He didn't answer. He was pushing her down, shielding her with his own body. He reached inside his jacket, and when his hand emerged, it was holding a sleek black handgun. The sight of it broke her. The man she loved, the man who brought her coffee and held her while she slept, was holding a gun as if it were an extension of his own arm. The violent reality of his world, a world she had so willfully ignored, crashed down on her with the force of the collision. The next few moments were a blur of chaos. The sound of shouting, the terrifying pop, pop, pop of gunfire. Min Jun was out of the car, a phantom of deadly efficiency moving through the attackers. Ilara squeezed her eyes shut, her hands over her ears, praying for it to stop. She could feel the vibrations of the fight through the frame of the car, feel the heat of Julian's body as he shielded her from the horror outside. And then, as quickly as it began, it was over. There was only silence, broken by the sound of Julian's harsh breathing and the distant wail of sirens. "It's over," he said, his voice strained. "They're gone." He moved off her, and she slowly sat up. Her eyes darted to the window. She saw men lying on the ground. She saw Min Jun, his face grim, checking on them. She saw the aftermath of a small, brutal war. She turned to Julian. His perfect suit was torn at the shoulder. There was a cut on his cheekbone, but it was his eyes that terrified her. They were the eyes of the man in the alley, cold, hard, and deadly. He looked at the gun in his hand, then at her, and the mask crumbled, replaced by a look of raw devastation. He had not wanted her to see this. He had tried to protect her from this truth. But the truth was out. It was lying in the street, bleeding on the asphalt. "Take me home," she whispered, her voice a thread. "Not my home, yours." The penthouse was silent. The view of the glittering city, once so beautiful, now seemed mocking. Ilara stood in the center of the vast, minimalist living room, her arms wrapped around herself. Julian stood by the window, his back to her, his shoulders slumped with a weight she was only just beginning to understand. "Tell me," she said. It wasn't a request. It was a demand. "Tell me everything. No more lies. No more secrets." He turned slowly. The fight had drained the color from his face, leaving him pale and stark beneath the recessed lighting. The king looked weary. "My family," he began, his voice low and heavy, "does not run a simple investment firm. We are the Cheongryong, the Blue Dragon." He paused, letting the name hang in the air. Ilara knew it. Everyone in the city knew it. They were a myth, a whisper, a powerful, shadowy organization tied to everything from construction and shipping to other darker things: extortion, violence. They were the Korean Mafia. Her heart felt like a block of ice in her chest. "My grandfather founded it," Julian continued, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the glass. "He built an empire from nothing. My father inherited it. And when he died, it fell to me. It was not a choice. It was a duty, a legacy of blood and honor that I was born into." He walked towards her, his movements slow, deliberate. "This world, it is all I have ever known. A world of violence, of loyalty that is bought with fear, of constant threats from men who want what I have. I have done things, Ilara, Things to protect my family, to maintain my position. Things you would not understand. You're a gangster, she said, the word tasting like poison. A criminal, a mafia boss. Yes, he said without flinching. In the eyes of your world, that is what I am. The confession settled over her, a suffocating shroud. Every beautiful moment they had shared was now tainted by this truth. The expensive gifts, the doctor for her mother. Where had that money come from? Whose suffering had paid for her mother's health? The thought made her feel sick. "The men tonight?" she asked, her voice trembling. "A rival faction. They saw you as a weakness. A way to get to me." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own. "That is why I tried to keep you separate, to protect you from this. But I was selfish. I wanted you in my life, even if it meant putting you in danger. I couldn't stay away." He reached for her, but she flinched back as if burned. The movement, small as it was, seemed to break him. "You are the only good thing in my life, Alara," he whispered, his voice cracking with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "The only pure thing. You are the color in my black and white world, just as I said. Without you, there is only darkness. I know this is monstrous. I know I am not the man you thought I was. But the man I am with you, he is real. He is the man I want to be." Her mind was a vortex of love and horror. The man she loved stood before her, confessing to a life of crime and violence. Her principles, the very core of who she was, screamed at her to run, to get away from this man and his poisoned world. But her heart, the foolish, traitorous thing, ached for him. It saw the prisoner inside the king, the lonely boy burdened with a crown he never asked for. She thought of her mother, healthy and hopeful for the first time in a decade. She thought of the safety she had felt in his arms. It was a false safety, built on a foundation of violence. It was a lie. "I need to think," she mumbled, backing away towards the door. I can't." She fled. She ran from the glass tower, from the beautiful monster she loved, and back to the familiarity of her own small, complicated life, where the only dangers were overdue bills and the threat of a broken heart. She hadn't known then that a heart could do more than break. It could shatter. For 2 days, she existed in a fog. She went to work, her movements robotic. Chloe tried to talk to her, but Alara couldn't form the words to explain. How could she say it? "The man I'm in love with is a crime boss. He saved my mother's life with blood money." It sounded like the plot of a terrible movie, but the feelings were real. The love was real, and the heartbreak was unbearable. She knew what she had to do. It was the only choice she could live with. It was the hardest choice of her life. She called him and asked him to meet her at the park where they'd had their first real date. She chose a neutral ground, a place that belonged to her world. The sky was a bruised purple, threatening rain. He was already there, waiting by the fountain. He looked as if he hadn't slept in days. The sight of him, so vulnerable and lost, nearly broke her resolve. And then the rain began to fall. It was a cold, miserable drizzle that quickly turned into a downpour, plastering her hair to her face and soaking her thin jacket. It felt fitting. She walked up to him, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. "I can't," she whispered, and the words were swallowed by the sound of rain sluicing down the slick asphalt. Her voice, the only music he had ever truly heard, was breaking. "I can't be this person, Julian, the one who looks away." He just looked at her, his dark eyes a sea of despair. "Don't," he managed to say, the single word a raw tear in the fabric of the night. She had to make him understand. "I love you," she said, the confession a double-edged sword of pain and truth. A tear mingled with the rain on her cheek. "But I can't live in your world. I can't build my happiness on the pain of others. I can't be the woman who sleeps in a beautiful penthouse bought with what? I would lose myself, Julian. I would become someone I hate." She reached into her bag and pulled out a key card to his penthouse and the credit card he had insisted she take for emergencies. She tried to press them into his hand, but he wouldn't take them. They fell to the wet ground between them. "Don't do this, Alara," he pleaded, his voice raw. "We can find a way. I can keep you safe. I can give you anything." "I don't want things," she cried. "I want a life. A normal life. A life where I'm not afraid of the sound of a car backfiring. A life where the man I love doesn't have to carry a gun." She took a step back, the finality of it tearing her apart. "Goodbye, Julian." She saw the fight go out of him, replaced by a chilling emptiness. He didn't try to stop her. He just stood there, a statue of a broken man, as the rain poured down. She turned and walked away, not daring to look back because she knew if she did, she would run back into his arms and be lost forever. Each step was an agony. She was walking away from the only man she had ever truly loved, back to a life that felt safe, but was now destined to be colorless and gray. The months that followed were a study in misery. For Ilara, the world had been leached of its color. She had her safety, her principles. She went to work at the coffee shop, came home, and tried to paint. But the canvas remained stubbornly white. The vibrant hues he had gifted her seemed to mock her from their neat rows. Her hands, which once found such joy in creation, felt clumsy and useless. The art was gone because the muse was gone. The inspiration, the fire, had been extinguished. Chloe tried her best. "You did the right thing," she would say, rubbing Ilara's back as she cried. "You couldn't live that life." "I know," Ilara would whisper. "I know." But knowing it and feeling it were two different things. Her heart didn't understand principles. It only understood the gaping, raw wound of his absence. She missed everything. She missed his intensity, the way his dark eyes would soften only for her. She missed his quiet presence as she worked. She missed the surprising gentleness of his hands. She even missed the danger, the thrilling, terrifying hum of being near so much power. Her life was quiet now. It was safe, and it was agonizingly empty. For Julian, the world was not gray. It was black, an endless, suffocating void. He had been in the dark before he met her, but he hadn't known it. She had shown him the sun, and then she had left, plunging him into a night darker than any he had ever known. He threw himself into the work. The Cheongryong had never been more profitable or more feared. He was colder, more ruthless than his father had ever been. He took risks, crushed rivals with merciless efficiency, and consolidated his power until he was untouchable. His uncle, Chairman Park, watched with greedy approval. "Now you are truly your father's son," the old man rasped, his eyes gleaming. "You have finally shed your weakness." Julian felt nothing. The victories were hollow. The power was ash in his mouth. He would return to the penthouse, the glass fortress in the sky, and her absence was a physical presence. A ghost in every room. He saw her everywhere, curled on the sofa where she used to sketch, her reflection in the glass he stared through. He hadn't touched the art supplies she had left behind. They sat on a table, a shrine to a life he had touched and lost. One night, Min Jun found him standing on the balcony, staring down at the city lights. He had a glass of whiskey in his hand, untouched. "You should not have let her go, sir," Min Jun said quietly. It was the most insubordinate thing he had ever said. Julian turned, his eyes empty. She was right to leave. This world, it would have destroyed her. Or it would have turned her into someone like me. Or, Min Jun countered, his gaze steady, she might have saved you. The words struck Julian with the force of a physical blow. Saved him. She had tried. She had shown him a different way to live, a different way to be. And he had shown her violence and fear. She had run from his world. But what if he changed the world? A spark ignited in the desolate wasteland of his soul, a tiny, fragile flicker of an impossible idea. He looked at his empire, this kingdom of shadows built on fear. It had brought him nothing but loneliness and had cost him the only thing that ever mattered. She couldn't live in his world, so he would build a new one, a world she could live in. The decision was a declaration of war. Julian called a meeting of the syndicate's elders, the powerful captains who ran the various factions. They gathered in a subterranean boardroom, a place of dark wood and darker secrets. His uncle, Chairman Park, sat at the head of the table, a venomous old snake coiled in the seat of power. Julian stood before them, not as their leader, but as their executioner. "The Cheongryong is changing," he announced, his voice echoing in the silent room. "Effective immediately, all illegal enterprises will be terminated. The extortion, the smuggling, the gambling rackets, all of it ends. We will focus solely on our legitimate businesses. The Kang Corporation will be a global leader in construction, technology, and hospitality. We will be clean." The silence was followed by an uproar. Men who had built their lives on violence and intimidation shouted in protest. But it was Chairman Park's voice that cut through the noise. "You are a fool," he hissed, his face purple with rage. "You spit on your father's grave. This is our legacy, our strength. You would turn us into common businessmen?" "My father's legacy is a prison," Julian retorted, his voice like steel. "A prison that cost me everything. The world has changed. We must change with it, or we will be destroyed. This is not a debate. It is a command." "And if we refuse?" another captain challenged. Julian's eyes swept over them, cold and absolute. "Then you are no longer part of the Cheongryong. You are my enemy, and you all know what happens to my enemies." The schism was immediate and bloody. Chairman Park led the dissenting factions clinging to the old ways. An internal war erupted, fought not in the streets, but in boardrooms, on the stock market, and in the dark alleys where loyalty was tested. Julian was relentless. He used his immense fortune to buy out rivals, his strategic mind to dismantle their operations, and, when necessary, Min Jun's brutal efficiency to eliminate the most stubborn threats. He was not cleaning his hands. He was using the dirt on them to scrub the organization from the inside out. It was a painful, ugly process. He lost men. He bled money. He accumulated new scars, both visible and not, but he was driven by a singular purpose. The image of Alara's face, her tear-streaked goodbye in the rain. He was becoming a man she would not have to run from. It took nearly a year of war and reconstruction. But in the end, Julian stood victorious. Chairman Park was exiled, his power broken. The Cheongryong was reborn as the Kang Corporation. It was still powerful, still feared in some circles, but its dealings were legitimate. The shadows remained, but they were the long shadows of the past, not the encroaching darkness of the present. Julian was changed. The coldness was still there, but it was tempered by exhaustion and a fragile, hard-won hope. He knew it was time. Alara had her first gallery show. It was a small affair, a group exhibition in a tiny gallery in a trendy part of town. She only had one piece on display. It was a portrait. A man's face, rendered in stark charcoal and flashes of violent blue. His expression was a maelstrom of power, loneliness, and pain. It was a portrait of Julian. She had finally been able to paint again, but he was all that would come out. It was her heart, exposed and bleeding on the canvas. She was standing by her piece, trying to ignore the polite murmurs of the small crowd, when she felt it. A familiar presence, a shift in the air. She turned, and he was there. He was standing at the entrance of the gallery, looking at her. He wasn't in one of his immaculate suits. He wore simple dark trousers and a gray cashmere sweater. He looked thinner. There were new lines of exhaustion around his eyes. He looked human. Her heart stopped. Then it began to pound so hard she thought it would break through her ribs. He walked towards her, his eyes never leaving hers. He didn't look at the art, at the other people. He only looked at her. He stopped in front of her painting. He stared at the tormented face she had created, and a flicker of understanding passed through his eyes. He saw it. He saw that she had understood his prison all along. "It's not clean," he said, his voice rough, as if he hadn't used it in a long time. The past will always be there. There are things I've done that can't be undone. He turned from the painting to face her. But the future is different, he continued, his voice thick with emotion. The business is legitimate. The violence is over. I'm different. I did it for you, Alara, to build a world where you wouldn't have to look away. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring his image. She saw the truth of his words etched on his face. She saw the war he had fought, the price he had paid. He hadn't just offered her his world, he had destroyed it and built a new one for her. It was the grandest gesture of love she could ever imagine. Julian, she breathed, her voice choked with a year of unspoken longing. He closed the final step between them, and all the pain, all the misery of their separation, all the desperate, aching love erupted in a single moment. He cupped her face in his hands, and his mouth found hers. The kiss was not gentle. It was a desperate, frantic collision. It was a year of lonely nights and silent screams. It was the reunion of two halves of the same soul, finally finding their way back to each other. It was raw and messy and beautiful. It was a promise of a new beginning, right there in the quiet gallery, surrounded by the ghosts of their past. It was the end of the darkness and the dawn of a fragile, precious light. A year later, the light was no longer fragile. It was a steady, warm glow that filled the house they had built together, a modern structure of wood and glass nestled in the hills overlooking the city. It was far enough away to feel peaceful, but close enough that Julian could still command his legitimate empire. The shadows of his past hadn't vanished completely. They never would. There were still threats from old enemies, resentments that festered in the dark. But they were no longer his burden to bear alone. They faced them together. Alara's resilience, her unwavering moral compass, had become his true north. Her love was his shield. He was no longer just the kingpin. He was Julian. He learned to smile, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes. He learned to sleep through the night without a weapon by his bed. She was no longer just surviving. She was thriving. The Kang Corporation was a major patron of the arts, and Alara, with his quiet support, had become a celebrated artist. Her work was vibrant, full of life and color. Her canvases were no longer filled with his pain, but with their shared joy. He was standing in the doorway of her studio now, watching her. The late afternoon sun streamed through the large windows, illuminating the specks of dust dancing in the air and setting her hair ablaze. She had a streak of bright yellow paint on her cheek, and she was completely absorbed in her work, a small, contented smile on her lips. He felt a wave of love for her so powerful it nearly brought him to his knees. She had been the color in his black and white world, but she had done more than that. She had given him a whole new canvas and taught him how to see the light. She must have felt his gaze because she turned, her smile widening when she saw him. "Hey, you," she said, her voice warm and soft. "Hey, you," he replied, walking into the room. He came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder, his gaze on the canvas. It was a landscape bursting with impossible, joyful color. He was redeemed. She was safe. Together, they were whole, and their future was as bright and limitless as the art she was creating. This story is a powerful reminder that love's true strength lies not in accepting darkness, but in inspiring a transformation towards the light. It explores the idea that no one is beyond redemption if they are willing to fundamentally change their world for the person they love. It's a journey about sacrifice, the collision of two vastly different worlds, and the courage to build a new future, leaving the ghosts of the past behind. We really hope you enjoyed this educational piece of content and hope that you could understand the moral lessons behind it. If this story moved you, please show your support by hitting the like button, subscribing to our channel for more dramatic romances, and sharing it with someone who appreciates a story of redemption and love against all odds. Now, for our question of the day. Do you think Alara was right to leave Julian initially, or should she have stayed and tried to change him from within? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And finally, help us choose our next story. What would you like to see next? A. The story of Min Jun, the loyal bodyguard, finding an unexpected love of his own. B. The backstory of Julian's father and how the Cheongryong Syndicate was built. Vote in the comments, and we'll see you in the next story.